Buffalo made the
Obama.
In Dayton, Ohio, told 9 more people losing their lives.
The world can be a very dangerous place, and we never know when an emergency is going to unfold. But if one does, will you know how to handle yourself? If you're not sure, you're already behind the power curve. And that is why I created Full Spectrum Warrior. Hey guys, welcome to the Full Spectrum Warriors podcast. My name is Rich Graham, and today I am joined by Steve Croskey, constitutional lawyer, and we are going to cover the Chevron Act and what this Supreme Court ruling means for our fight against tyranny here within the country. Once again, the Full Spectrum Warriors podcast is sponsored by Grunt Style, the American apparel brand, so check them out and let's jump right into this hot topic. Steve, welcome back to the Full Spectrum Warriors podcast.
Thank you again for having me.
Good to have you. Some big time things to talk about. Some big developments since the last time we spoke are happening within the government and the rulings with the Supreme Court.
Absolutely, yeah, for sure.
So when we were talking off camera or microphone, whatever you want to call it, one of the things we were talking about, and we'll get into this more, was discussing what actually defines tyranny. And it's really interesting because we're here on July 5th. Yesterday was our Independence Day. And everyone's like, America, home of the free because of the brave, freedom isn't free, all the thousands of American pride slogans, right? But then you still talk to people, and on the flip side of all this stuff of America is the freest country in the world and the best country in the world, you start talking to a lot of people and they understand that, America isn't really free and we're not really free. And you have a lot of people talking about how we're enslaved to debt and we're enslaved to taxes. And there's so many rules and regulations and the government is just micromanaging every little tiny aspect of our lives. People getting together yesterday for 4th of July celebrations are using gas cans to fill up their lawnmower, right? And the gas cans have to have specific nozzles on them. And these nozzles change every couple of years to meet safety requirements because you're too much of an idiot to be able to use a normal gas nozzle to fill up a freaking lawnmower. And then, oh, by the way, the lawnmower you're using, that should probably be electric and not gas powered anymore because there's new regulations on, which type of lawnmower you can use. And the food, the hot dogs and the hamburgers have to be handled and packaged and processed in a certain way. There's certain regulations that go with that.
Or the fireworks are shooting.
And the fireworks. And, oh, by the way, the bread and the sugar and all this stuff that you're using needs to have, priority is set to high fructose corn syrup or soy oils or whatever. You know what I mean? Every single little piece of this stuff is being micromanaged, and there's government agencies that have been put in place that are not following the Constitution, as we talked about in the previous episodes, but in regards to the Second Amendment and how the ATF was trying to create rules and then create penalties or taxes for specific features that you want on a firearm and what the penalties would be. And they're basically self-regulating. And we spoke about how that if you go back far enough, that's not really constitutional, but here we are. And recently, and I'm excited to talk to you about this, the Supreme Court saw the Chevron case and basically overthrew and found this to be unconstitutional, which just basically stripped this huge tyrannical, really a fourth branch of government that had been created not too long ago. And I know you're going to get into that. But I just think it's a very fitting conversation for the 4th of July weekend, considering that there's literally wars, there's revolutions that take place to rein back the oppression of a government that we just had happen through this Supreme Court ruling without a single shot being fired. And I don't think that the American people understand how big of a decision this was and how much this actually means as far as our rights and our liberties as they were originally entrusted to us through the powers of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in regards to what has occurred over the last 40 years.
Yeah, no, that's a great way of putting it, and it's a really fascinating thing to see. One, as an American, but two, as a constitutionalist and an attorney myself, right? And I know we've gone into this in some of the other podcasts. I like to. It's easy to just say the year 1984, right? But I like to slow down and really kind of pull that out. Like, what does that mean, right? 1984. Well, if you were born in 1984, right now you'd be 40 years old, right? Well, okay. Say you were born 1983, and you were 1 year old at the time in 1984. Do you really know how the government functions when you're a 1 year old? No, absolutely not, right? You probably don't really understand, or at least not even understand, but start having a lot of governmental regulations start affecting your life until probably your teenage years, right? Maybe 14, 15 years old, plus or minus, depending on your circumstances. So it's pretty fair to say that if you were born before 1985, you probably don't know any better than how Chevron affected everyone's lives, and then how it not necessarily affected everyone's lives, but it was the catalyst and the pivot point, really, in American democracy, or at least for how the way our government was found up with the three, originally founded with the three branches of government. It was that tremendous pivot away from how things were originally set up, right? So I'd like to first start explaining what the Chevron Doctrine is, right? First off, it's an old Supreme Court case from 1984. Meaning that the Supreme Court of the United States at that time specifically had this issue in front of them, and they decided that courts shall defer to agencies' interpretations of silent or ambiguous statutes, even if the court would have interpreted the silent or ambiguous statute in another way. So in essence, in 1984, the stage was set for agencies to have the power to create law, enforce law, and interpret law, all under the same roof. Now let's go back. I know we like tying everything back to the Founding Fathers, right? Everyone likes to do that. And what does that mean, right? Well, let's look at what James Madison specifically wrote and stated. He wrote that the accumulation of all powers, the legislative, executive, and judiciary, in the same hands, whether of one, a few, or many, and whether hereditary, self-appointed, or elective, may justly be pronounced the very definition of tyranny.
So that's where I'm saying we've literally been living in tyranny, and most people don't even realize it. And I would say, literally, if you were born around 1970 or maybe in the late 60s, you wouldn't truly understand this. What the government was supposed to be operating like, because you're too young. Like you were saying, like in 1984, you wouldn't know really, unless you were born after like 1966. Because a 15-year-old doesn't really understand.
Fair enough.
You're not living an adult life yet. You're not having to deal with all these regulations, taxes, try to run a business, try to buy a home, build something. You know what I mean? Run a company. So you're not actually engaging in all of these things. You're just kind of living your life, and you got some rules about you, but you don't really truly understand what it is you're encountering yet.
Yeah. So let's talk about agencies for a second, right? And what are they, right? I mean, that's I know we keep saying this and we brush over it, and not to talk to you like you're stupid, but obviously, and I think every school to this day still teaches this, that our government was founded with three separate branches. I think everyone agrees on that, right?
Yep.
You got the executive branch, which is the branch that is specifically tasked with enforcing the law, right? That's like your sheriff's department, that's your governor, that's your president. All of that flows from the executive powers, the executive branch, right? That's branch one. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the most important branch by labeling it number one, but in either event, there's the second branch is the legislative branch, right? That's the branch that creates the laws, right? They're the ones that say we decide that blah blah blah, whatever blah 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 means, that's going to be the law. Right now, the executive, or I'm sorry, the legislative doesn't get to enforce the law, and they don't get to interpret it. They just get to create it. Okay. Now, there's the third branch. There's the judiciary. The judiciary is specifically tasked with, well, a lot of things, but in a nutshell, interpreting the law when it's vague. Right. So you got these three different laws. They're all under separate roofs, and they all should, in theory, keep each other in check. That way, and again, and the way we're set up in America is everything stems from, one, the people, which created the Constitution, and then the Constitution is the parameter, at least in theory. I know it doesn't work like this in the real world anymore, but in theory, that's the parameter for what the government is allowed to operate inside of, right? Well, now, when you have Chevron, that specific Supreme Court allowed that, well, one, let me back up. At that point in time, the legislature, there was a phenomena, right? So, and I'll get into this in a second, and this will make sense contextually, but the legislative branch was already, we'll say, overwhelmed at the time, is probably the best way of putting it. And they would be like, okay, well, we're, 200 people. We meet every so often. There's a rapid fire amount of stuff that's coming our way we need to deal with. We don't have time to deal with this. So we're going to delegate our authority on this specific issue, right? Let's pick air, right? Let's pick the environment for a second, right? They'll be like, we're going to delegate to the EPA the ability to regulate the environment. And we'll let them study it. We'll let them figure it out. And they're going to write regulations about what applies to the environment. Okay? Well, agencies are already a part of the executive branch. So the legislature is kicking the can over to the agency at that point by delegation, saying, you guys make the law and you enforce it on this specific topic. Chevron went a step further and said specifically that courts shall now also defer to agencies whenever an agency decides to interpret an ambiguous statute or a silent statute. Well, statutes are silent, but if the legislative branch didn't address a specific issue, Chevron allowed that agency to interpret that silence and or ambiguity however they wanted.
And that's interesting because, again, going back to the Constitution said the opposite of we're going to list the things that the federal government can do, and if it's not written in that, then you don't have authority over it.
Exactly. The 10th Amendment, right?
Yeah. So that was like, this is a exact opposite of like you had with the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, you had a limited government. And now with this ruling in 1984 that basically said the government has the ability to assert its authority however it sees fit, and it's not limited anymore. In fact, it's all encompassing. And now, again, the separation of those branches, now you've taken all of those branches and put them underneath one appointed person, and no one ever voted on this person. This is just, you have no say in this whatsoever.
And according to James Madison, and I think a lot of people agree with this, that is the very definition of tyranny.
Yeah, so now you have like a mini dictator, and maybe they're not controlling every aspect of your life, but you have a mini dictator, this little mini tyrant, who now has complete authority over a specific category, and they get to write their own laws, they get to enforce it, they get to tell you what the penalties are, how much money you have to pay in fees, fines, whatever, and then they get to regulate it.
And they get to establish the procedures on how to challenge it, or the lack thereof of procedures on how to challenge it, and they get to decide themselves if they screwed up on the bottom level of what you're challenging. They're kind of like their own judge, jury, executioner, fact finder, all under one roof. And what happens here, right? So let's read the 10th Amendment for a second, right? Back to this, because I want to lay this, because this is important throughout today's episode and all the episodes we've talked about. And I think we've harped on this in some of the other episodes, but the 10th Amendment specifically states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay? And inherently in that, the only way that you can delegate powers to the United States is, one, if you have them yourself, right? So if originally the people had the power and they're the ones that delegated certain powers to the United States government through the Constitution. And it says if it wasn't given to the government, the people still have it, right? Now let's go to Chevron. Chevron specifically, so inherently, if the people were silent, and if it wasn't expressly given to the federal government, then the 10th Amendment's clear. The federal government does not have that power. Silence does not transfer power according to the 10th Amendment. Chevron doesn't necessarily specifically say that, but what it says is that agencies now have the power to interpret silence or ambiguities. And
which that goes against even like from your general legal parameters. If I have the right to remain silent, if there's charges or something brought against me, or if a police officer wants to arrest me for something, someone thinks I committed a crime, I have the right to remain silent. And my silence does not make me guilty. You can't assume or assert that I committed a crime because I say I'm going to use my Fifth Amendment right and I'd like to speak to my lawyer, right? So like that's been from like the very, very beginning of our governmental structure and your rights as an individual. And now they're basically taking that aspect of what is understood practice, understood rights, understood law, and they're flipping it on their head and saying, oh, well, in the absence of speech, we get to determine what the absence of that speech thus says.
Yep. And I would like to, one, point out that what we see a lot, or what we've noticed happen over the last 40 years since Chevron, is a lot of these agencies will use Chevron and their powers from it. Not I don't know if they knew they were using it specifically, but it just kind of morphed into this, where if the legislative branch specifically says we're going to task the EPA to maintain the environment and figure out what's best for the environment, well, a lot of the times if the EPA will be looking at something and they'll be like, well, we want to do these certain things like gas cans, right? Like you brought up the gas cans earlier. Was that specific authority delegated to them by the legislator? Probably not. I don't know the EPA that well, and we'll get into specific examples here in a second that apply a little bit more. But now these agencies, if they were never specifically delegated a task through the legislation, they're allowed to interpret that silence however they want. So what a lot of times we saw is if they were confused about what their powers were, or if they were confused about what a statute may or may not have delegated to them, all inferences got resolved in favor of the agency.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And it allowed them to just grab a tremendous amount of power.
But a lot of people would be like, how in the world did we go from being the most free country in the world and having the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, individual liberties, all this kind of stuff, to the position we're in now, where every single thing is freaking illegal? Everything, like, there's more freaking rules and things on the book. It goes back and it talks about back in the day of the Bible, like people who were slaves paid 20% in taxes. You know what I mean? 10 to 20%, you're considered a slave. And now, people are paying 50, 70, 90% in taxes. It's absolutely absurd, in different fees. And not even in taxes, that's just taxes. You look at fees and dude, you name it. Like, you could put whatever little catchphrase on it so that it's not called a tax. But at the end of the day, we pay more and we're regulated so much. And everything, they say like the average person breaks like 5 laws a day and they don't even know it. You know, and you ask yourself, how in the world did we go from being so free to being so regulated? And I'm almost positive this is a huge component of how that happened.
Yeah.
Right underneath our nose.
Well, look at just in the last couple of years, right? I'm just going to list out a few things here, like the COVID vaccine mandates or the mask mandates that were going out, right? Like OSHA mandating the vaccine for over 80 million Americans. Like, okay, maybe, right? Maybe a vaccine is a good thing in certain circumstances, right? But what gives OSHA the power to just mandate it and require you to have to do it if you want to travel or work at your job? You know, that you got one agency that says you have to do this if you want to show up to work tomorrow and keep your job. You have to take this vaccine, right? Or if you want to fly on this airplane,
let's talk
you got to
for a
wear a
second.
mask. Like maybe the answer is correct, but how you get to that answer, that's the problem. One person being able to decide that, or a group of under one roof being able to set that rule, interpret their own rule, and enforce it when and how they want, that's the problem.
Yeah. And like you said, with the, I mean, there's so many freaking examples of this.
Well, let's look at, like, not, okay, first, I want to set the framework on this too. There is a need for agencies, right? Because agencies are important in a lot of regards, right? So I'm not saying we're not saying agencies are worthless by any means, right? But let's look at the TSA, for instance, right? A very, very important agency out there. I agree we need it, especially with air travel and the way things are in the current world. However, one of the things that in my opinion, I think is a perfect example of overreaching through the Chevron Doctrine that the TSA does, is TSA regulations prohibit interfering with a TSA official. All right, let's stop for a second. Makes sense. Right? I think that it's probably a good idea that you shouldn't be able to go up and just mess with this person's job who's trying to keep everyone safe. In theory, that sounds fine. It sounds great. Awesome. Okay, well, let's go a little further. What does the TSA decide about that? What does interfering mean? Well, under Chevron, the TSA gets to decide what that means. And according to TSA's website, any behavior that is offensive or disruptive and takes officials away from their stations or work could be considered interference. Okay, that's good to know. And is both a federal civil violation and a federal crime. Passengers are permitted, and I'm reading from the website, actually, I got this from their website, from TSA's website. Passengers are permitted to ask questions about the screening process and are free to express their feelings about TSA, so long as they do so in a way that does not interfere with the TSA agent's official duties. At any time you disobey a TSA agent's instructions, you run the risk of violating the law. If you think you are treated unfairly, you can file a complaint with the TSA Office of Civil Rights and Liberties. So again, how is this set up? The TSA, 1, made that rule. 2, the TSA enforces that rule. They get to decide if you're interfering with them or not, and they get to decide what conduct counts as interference or not. And then 3, they get to interpret any ambiguity as far as if it's interference or not, or if you pulled them away from their official duties. What is their official duties? Well, if you have a problem you want to ask and you want to complain, if you get in this situation, you have to ask, TSA gets to make that determination. And
then if you have a problem with it, you submit your claim to the TSA.
To the TSA.
And they can evaluate whether your claim is sufficient or not.
Yep, and under Chevron, any interpretation that TSA has on that issue, on that rule that they created, their view controls. Even if a court would have interpreted it a different way. If an actual judicial court, right, one of your judges at one of your courthouses interprets it differently than TSA does, Chevron specifically makes it that the TSA's interpretation of it controls.
Yeah, and here's an example of that. This is such crap. I went to SHOT Show, and I spoke about this to you before, but, for the people listening, I went to SHOT Show and got a gift. It was a magazine, a 30-round magazine, right? And it had it was a party favor. Everyone who showed up to this event got one of these company magazines, and for a rifle, AR-15 magazine, a 30-round magazine, legal in Nevada, legal in Florida, legal in almost every state. I'm going through the TSA check. It was in my backpack. I didn't have any checked luggage. I wasn't traveling with a gun, and I got stopped, and they said that they had to take this. I couldn't bring it on the plane. And I just asked them, why can't I bring that on the plane? There's no ammunition, there's no firearms. And they said, oh, well, this is a gun part. You can't have a gun or gun parts. And I'm like, well, technically it's not a gun part. It's not I work in the firearms industry. I understand what all this is. It's not a gun part.
Fair enough. I'm going to stop you right there for a second, not to be rude and interrupt, but again, under Chevron, TSA's interpretation controls in that situation.
Exactly. So I explained to them, look, a gun part would be an actual piece of the gun that aids in the operation of the actual weapon system. A magazine does not need to be present to still shoot a gun. You can load one round at a time and shoot a gun. So if anything, it's an accessory. It is not actually a gun part. So after I'm having this conversation with the agents, the supervisor comes over, we're having this discussion on whether this is an accessory or a part. At the end of the day, I'm going to miss my flight. I'm like, it is what it is. They take it, they confiscate it, and they throw it in the trash can. Right. And I'm like, all right, whatever. I get on the plane. I have TSA pre-check. I have global entry. Now, all of my travel, every time I go to the airport, I get flagged for a random check. And I travel a lot for work, and I was traveling a lot at that time. I was flying probably 2 to 3 times a month, round trips. So 4 to 6 flights a month. 4 to 6 times a month for the next 4 or 5 months in a row. I'm every single time getting my TSA pre-checked is not approved, and I'm getting pulled aside for a random screening, and they dig through my bags and all this stuff. And I'm like, dude, how is this random when this is happening every single time? I complain. I'm like, dude, I paid for TSA pre-check. What is the deal? This went on for 11 and a half months. I called supervisors. I talked to people. I just kept getting passed around and around and around. And even though I had never been charged or convicted of a crime, right? Although I paid for the TSA pre-check, right? I paid for this service, and now I was being denied it. 11 and a half months later, I get a notification that due to my good conduct and not having any further disciplinary, things transpire, that I'm now being officially removed from the watch list and the suspected dangerous watch list that they had me on, like a red flag list. And I finally get in touch with someone from TSA and the supervisor level that will talk to me about this, which I had no idea I was on. And I'm like, why am I getting a notification that I'm being removed from this watch list? Why am I on a watch list? And they're like, oh, well, it shows that your record has that you tried to bring a gun on the plane. And I'm like, what do you mean I tried to bring a gun on a plane? And they're like, I never tried to bring a freaking gun on the plane. I've checked lots of guns. I've never tried to bring a gun on the plane. And they're like, this says here in January of whatever year you tried to bring a gun on the plane. Well, after us doing some digging, it turns out that those guys at TSA, with me having a magazine, it went from a magazine being a gun part or an accessory, arguing those guys put on my record. Now it's an official. On my official record, it says that I tried to sneak a gun on a plane in Las Vegas. And nothing ever... I never went before a court. I never got arrested. I never got charged with anything. There was is just some dudes put that on my record, and now I have that I'm a dude who tried to smuggle a gun on a plane. And there's no one you can charge or take that up with, because every time you try to argue it, you get passed from one person at TSA to another person at TSA, and then you get the round robin. So eventually, it got put behind us, but now I'm dealing with the same thing with my global entry. Now my global entry got, taken away. I can't come through customs the same way I did. No one will tell me what the crime was that I did, but I've never been charged with a crime. I've never been accused of a crime. They just pulled my global entry, and I'm back on some watch list, and they won't tell me why I'm on a watch list. And again, it's one of those things where it's like the person who you would petition this to is the person of the same agency who put this stuff into effect, and you have no recourse. You hit a dead end every time.
And back to this whole, if you were born, what year did you pick? 1965, 1966?
Yeah, something like that.
This is just what we've just known. This is just how we've just known it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, Chevron was 1984. What about the entire 208 years prior to that, prior to Chevron being put into place? Right? Yeah. It never operated this way.
Yeah.
Never did.
I mean, I remember you used to be able to go up to the gate, and when people would come visit, you could meet them at the gate of the plane, and they'd come off, and you're there waiting for them. You watch, and that wasn't even that long ago. You watch all the old movies, and people would be right up there at the gate, and you'd go onto the plane. You used to be able to smoke on a plane. You used to be able to bring a knife and all that stuff on a plane. Like these are all more recent laws.
Yeah. Well, funny enough, we were, I don't know, maybe 6-7 months ago, we were in Geneva, Switzerland, right? We were in Geneva, Switzerland at the airport, and already through security, and I'm just walking, and I noticed one of the gift shops, you can buy knives, like right outside of the gate. And I kind of was just like, I was taken back for a second, because I was like, oh my God, like, how are you able to sell knives? And I'm like, all right, well, we're in a different country. And then like I joked with the lady at the cash register, and I was just like, that's, it's kind of crazy. You can just buy knives here. And she's like, what do you mean? Like, of course you can buy knives here and take them on the plane, It's like, duh, and like they were looking at me like I was the weirdo, and here we are. I'm not suggesting it's a good idea to bring a knife on the plane right now by any means. Don't, right? You're getting in a lot of trouble, but like I'm in a different country. I'm supposed to be a free person representing from America, and I'm like, how are you able to do this? And they're just like, what do you mean? You can't bring knives on the plane? It's like, that weird situation where, anyways, but we're not necessarily saying that agencies are a bad thing, right? I mean, let's talk about how they kind of came up in the first place. Like, how did agencies even really start, right? Like, what's their purpose, right? There's pros and cons to anything, right? Well, it's essentially the New Deal, right? The New Deal came about in 1933 through 1938. It was implemented by President Roosevelt, and it was a series of programs, public works, financial reforms, and regulations that were an attempt to rescue the U.S. from the Great Depression. During this time, there was a rapid increase in the number of powerful federal agencies under FDR. Because of bureaucrats in these various agencies are unelected, and because they combine executive, legislative, and judicial functions, agencies have been criticized as undermining the separation of powers between the three branches of government. On the other hand, agencies serve an important practical purpose because they can address problems more quickly and in more detail a lot of the times than Congress can. So in the 30s, there was this phenomena of the president and or Congress saying, you know what, we got all these new programs, our environment's going to crap, we need to fix that. I don't have time. I'm the president. If Franklin Delano Roosevelt was like, I don't have time to fix the problem. Also deal with what is heating up over in Europe right now. Also, everything that's internally going on in the country between education and taxes and law enforcement and whatever, water, you name it, right? That's what the executive branch is tasked with. So, of course, they look for help. They look for people to come in, and this is what cabinet positions are, right? Like the Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Defense, all these different things. These are people who are appointed over top of these agencies to deal with that narrow funnel of an issue to get more specific on it. Now, there was a concern at that time that, okay, well, these agencies are starting to get too much power, right? So what happened was that in 1946, the Administrative Procedure Act was passed. During the rise and expansion of FDR's New Deal, there was this growing concern. So Congress went ahead and passed an act that was going to say and essentially dictate and be a roadmap for how these agencies and what parameters they need to operate in. It's still in effect today and has, quite frankly, been in effect this entire time. The APA interestingly, is very clear in that it states that when it comes to interpreting the law shall be decided by the court system and not the agency enforcing the law. Specifically, 5 U.S.C. Section 706 states that to the extent necessary to decision and when presented, the reviewing court shall decide all relevant questions of law, interpret constitutional and statutory provisions, and determine the meaning or applicability of the terms of an agency action. Let's talk about this for a second, right? Relevant questions of law. In the law, there's 2 different types of categories, and these are terms of art. There's questions of law, and then there's questions of fact. Right? Questions of law specifically arises when a rule, regulation, law, or statute is silent or ambiguous. The judicial branch is specifically tasked with interpreting and settling what that rule, regulation, law, or statute means. Questions of fact, on the other hand, they don't necessarily apply to today's podcast, but just to make the distinction, when facts are in dispute, right? Like, did he do it or not? Was he drunk at the time he was driving? Was he even driving at the time he was drunk, right? Certain facts that have to be proven, a fact finder gets to decide which facts are true and which facts are not. That's the role of a jury for the most part, right? Sometimes you can waive it. Well, you can always waive a jury if you want, and then the judge becomes a fact finder too, but inherently the judge is the person or the body of law, if you will, that decides all relevant questions of law. So inherently in our government, the judicial branch has always, or originally, has been tasked with interpreting all questions of law. Ambiguous statutes, silent statutes, anytime there was a loophole, the people like to call it, that's what judges either fill in, decide what that means, and then that's what applies to everybody at hand, right? On the other hand, you also have the Administrative Procedure Act that says specifically that that reviewing courts shall decide all relevant questions of law. So not only do you have the Constitution and the way we've always done things through common law, but you also have the Administrative Procedure Act. For the entire 208 years before Chevron, that's how our country operated, right? If there was a dispute on what this like back to the TSA, what does it mean to interfere with a TSA official, right? Well, prior to Chevron, a court got to decide what does interfering mean? What does it not mean, right? And that's what the Administrative Procedure Act, that's what the Constitution says. Chevron completely reversed that and completely turned that on its head. The entire 208 years of our principles, Chevron went and said that now courts shall defer to the agency's interpretation of a silent or ambiguous statute. Huge departure and from how we were originally founded.
Yeah, and that's literally like what the TSA did when in my situation I was just talking about is they got to define what a gun was.
Yeah.
And they literally called a magazine a gun, and they're like, they never took that off my record. They just said, okay, don't worry about it because your year-long probation period is now ended. You're good. We're going to reinstate your thing for you to be able to fly again without all the extra scrutiny. But it's like, but that's not the definition of a gun. You know, a magazine is not a gun. And they're like, oh, well, guns or gun parts. And it's like, but it's not a gun part and it's an accessory.
Right.
They're like, oh, well, we consider it a gun part. So it's labeled as a gun. But it didn't say gun part. It said I brought a gun on the plane.
Yeah.
Or tried to. You know what I mean? But again, we'll get into that later. Like the stuff that happened with the ATF. Unless you want me to talk about that now.
You can talk about it now. Yeah, you
but
can
like
talk about
same thing happened when the ATF we were dealing with the whole thing with the pistol brace. So they had rulings with the pistol brace of what was and what wasn't. Then that carried over into the interpretation from the ATF of what is a class 2 item and who will have access to a class 2 item or a 3 item. So basically, if you had a suppressor, a fully automatic rifle, a short barreled rifle, they were now saying that someone who had a pistol brace on a rifle, right, or a pistol brace, they're considering it a short barreled rifle. And now they were going to start saying, and this got shot down, thankfully, but at the time, they were basically saying that if it is illegal for anyone to have access, the way they had this new way of interpreting the law, right? They were saying that anyone who had access to a suppressor, fully automatic, a short-barreled rifle, or anything like that, you were, what was the phrase called, where you were guilty by, like, if you were in proximity.
constructive possession.
Constructive possession, that was the magic word. So constructive possession meant that if I went to the shooting range and I had my rifle with a suppressor on it on the table, and I took my hand off of it and turned around to load a magazine, and someone else was within reach, like in the next bay over, standing next to me, right? And they could theoretically reach the gun, and I didn't have it in my hand. We were now both committing a felony, right? Because that person could have constructive possession of something that they're now saying that no one but the registered agent who was filed the paperwork for that weapon or that item could no one else could no longer have constructive possession of it. And if they did, they were committing a felony.
And to be clear, that was the ATF's interpretation of that, correct?
Yes, that was the ATF's new interpretation of how when they tried to do the pistol brace, and they were going to take 40 plus million AR pistols and now classify them as a class 2 item, as a short barreled rifle. In addition to that, one of the things that they snuck into that bill or that new definition of the law was the constructive possession. So that now meant that if you did not live by yourself, if you had a safe that you kept your guns in and your wife had access to your safe, but it was registered in your name, you and your wife were now committing a felony because she could get access to it. If you went to the range, no one could shoot it. So now I'm asking them, and I'm like, okay, well, if I'm calling up the ATF and trying to talk to their customer support, and I'm like, hey, this is what you guys are currently saying. Unless this gets overruled by a judge, this is what you guys are defining the new law as, and this is your interpretation of your law, right? So if I run courses and I have students who come to our range, can my students no longer shoot those rifles, right, with a suppressor on them? If I have someone who's coming who wants to purchase one, they can still purchase them. How do you let someone test fire or to even look at one of these and hold it in their hand and feel how heavy it is or anything like that if you're saying that no one can have that constructive possession unless they have the legal paperwork done and have paid their tax stamp?
These were your questions to the ATF over the phone?
Yeah, and the ATF was like, oh, well, we're not really sure. I talked to another agent, and then that agent's like, yeah, that's what it says, but we're really not going to enforce that.
Today they don't want, maybe what about tomorrow?
Exactly. But you're basically the response you're getting is like, yeah, that's what we're saying it is, but don't worry, we're not going to enforce it that way. You know what I mean? And you're like, but you could. Like, if there's a video or a photo of us at the range and a year from now or 6 months from now or whatever, if I talk to someone else comes and does an audit and finds that we did, or an investigator sees us, one of the people coming to the range and shooting one of these and testing it to see if they want to purchase one, well, that agent's going to say, well, who told you that? I don't know why they told you that. The statute's clear. It's right here in writing. It says constructive possession, XYZ. You are committing a felony. Why would you listen to what the agent told you on the phone? This is what it says right here. So there was every agent, every person you talked to gave you a different, because we talked to them 5 times. And in 5 times, we got a different example or a different understanding of what their own rule was and how it was going to be executed, right? And administered with 5 different agents. We got 5 different, types of feedback on that.
Well, that exact phenomena across so many different agencies, right? And I'm sure like anyone listening to this probably has their own examples of how this has gone affray, whether it's they're talking to the local building department, trying to get permits pulled, whatever agency you're dealing with, whether it's getting a driver's license reinstated, right? All of that's through agency. The U.S. Supreme Court last Friday, right, specifically stated, and I'm going to quote, Chevron allows agencies to change course even when Congress has given them no power to do so. By its sheer breadth, Chevron fosters unwarranted instability in the law, leaving those attempting to plan around agency action in an internal fog of uncertainty.
Yeah, that kind of makes me think of every year when you go to your taxes. Like, the tax code changes every single year. And you have to have an accountant because you're like, oh, I don't know what the new law is. And most of the accountants don't even know what the new law is. It's like 3,000 pages and it changes every year. And, you're like, I'm trying to follow the rules that you guys made up, but you keep changing the rules. So how am I supposed to stay current on this when you guys just keep changing it?
Yeah. One of the things that you keep seeing throughout history is that, if anything, history has taught us time and time again, and as the last 40 years have shown us, that when you put all of this power into one group's hand under one roof, tyranny is sure to follow, right? Absolute power corrupts absolutely.
Yeah.
Right, and I think it was Lord Action that said that in 1857, right? And it's a pretty common saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely.
And when you look at this from the aspect of, okay, you have this little mini tyrant, this little mini dictator controlling this, but how many agencies are there? Like, there's literally thousands.
The Department of Defense, the IRS, the TSA, the FBI, the CIA, NSA, ATF, EPA, FAA, the Food and Drug Administration, the CDC, the Department of Education, property appraisers' offices, the DHSMV, the Army Corps of Engineers, the Department of Commerce, OSHA. I could say it for hours.
Yeah, fish
for
and
days.
Game, wildlife, and then within those there's subcategories underneath all of those, and we have those for state and federal. And when you look at how many agencies there are, and if they're all allowed to create their own their own rules and basically create this fourth branch of government where they're self-regulating, right? Like you're saying, absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And with that also, I lost my train of thought. What I was going to say with that.
Well, look at this, right? Let's go to the opposing viewpoint for a second, okay? Right? Let's look at people who actually support Chevron, right? And that are sad or frustrated or angry to see it go. A lot of what I've heard, and I've seen people say this, and people said it to me, that Chevron did not invite tyranny because you still had the ability to complain directly to the agency to try and get the agency to change their policies.
That's exactly what. Okay, that's what I was gonna say. Is you have people say that America. You have people arguing right now that America is a democracy. It's not a democracy. It's a democratic republic. And we're supposed to be able to vote on the people who we have appointed to represent us, right? One of the problems with this fourth branch of government that's been created through this one finding, which is in contradiction to 208 years of law, is none of these people are voted on. You know what I mean? So exactly what you're talking about right there. Like, okay, the only person that, if you don't like how that's being, that agency's being run, we don't have a single say right now. If you don't like, the CIA is a popular one, you don't like how that's being run, there's no one you're going to vote. You can't vote to change the head of that agency.
The dissenting opinion, the people who oppose Chevron being overturned, their view is that you get to vote for the president, and the president appoints these people. So their view is, and whether or not you agree with this or not, right, just to look at both sides of the coin here, their view is you do, and you get to vote for the president. And you should pay attention because the president's going to appoint all these people.
Well, so for example, when Trump got into office, you have people in these positions. I think this is really where you get into the deep state, or one of the examples of the tentacles of the deep state is you have this entire bureaucracy of unelected officials who wind up having more control. Like, if you think about how many things that these agencies regulate inside your everyday life, they have way more influence over the intricacies of how your daily lifestyle looks than most of the people in Congress and the Senate and governor, maybe not governors and whatnot, but like all these agencies, these really affect every single microscopic thing within your life. And
everything, man. Like, you can really finely get down into that rabbit
like, you're
hole.
you're not allowed to drink freaking raw cow milk.
Right.
You're not allowed to, I can't be like, hey, I'm a fucking grown up, I want to drink raw goat milk. I'll take the risk. Let me drink it. They're like, no, you can't do that. What do you mean? It's fresh from an animal. You want to go have New Jersey doesn't allow you to have a garden. It's against the rules to have gardens and to let your friends have that because they're saying that you're breaking commerce and it hasn't been checked by the Food and Drug Administration or whatever the agency is or whatever. But it's like, dude, you're telling me I can't just grow my own food and let my friend have a fucking tomato from my garden?
And here's the other thing, and we need to flesh this out too. This is super important. Another thing that the dissent has that they keep bringing up is these agencies, right? Their view is that these agencies are experts in their fields. Therefore, we need to defer to them. We need them to go ahead. Why should we overrule these objections, right? One of the articles that came out, I think it was from the LA Times, specifically said, by doing this, by the Supreme Court, the LA Times, the headline reads, with its Chevron ruling, the Supreme Court shows that it thinks it's smarter than scientific experts, right? And I'm going to get into this in a second because the majority in the Supreme Court, in the case that overturned it, Loper Bright Enterprises is the name of the case that overturned Chevron. The majority actually gets into this, right? And they're like, we as the Supreme Court, right? This is the majority speaking. We as the Supreme Court, and this, I'm not quoting them, I'm paraphrasing at this point. They're saying that, we're not saying the experts are irrelevant. We want their opinion. But now, instead of telling us what we have to do, they have to persuade us that we should do it their way. They have to sit there and actually come to us and persuade us to enforce and make a rule that says maybe we shouldn't have more than 6 chickens in our backyard. Maybe we should. Maybe we shouldn't have gardens in our backyard. Maybe we should. Let's sit and debate about this. Let's talk about this. Let's talk about the pros and cons about this. Maybe we shouldn't let companies dump a bunch of chemicals into our rivers. That's probably a good idea to stop them from doing that, right? But to have one small group under one roof tell us what we have to do in all these instances, whether it's drinking raw milk, whether it's the length of our barrel on our rifle, or whether or not it's a pistol brace or a bump stock, or the amount of chickens I'm allowed to have in my backyard, or if I'm allowed to collect runoff the rainwater from my roofs and how and when and all this sort of stuff. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have these discussions.
Yeah. Or even like the federal government, through the housing and development agency forcing towns and essentially it's forcing taxpayers. Your town has to have a certain amount of low-income housing in your community. That's why you see all these. Have you ever noticed that there's these giant apartment complexes being built everywhere in every single town? The same damn looking apartment complex. That's being forced on the taxpayer, right? They came in. We didn't vote on that. They're forcing you to put in all this stuff in your towns, and you have no say in it.
Yeah, and I mean, look, anything we could talk literally for probably months. There's so many examples out there, but the big things, right? Like, and that probably strike a lot of chords, positive or negative, right? In recent history, vaccine mandates, right? To be able to get on a plane, you had to wear a mask. To be able to come into work, you got to show proof of vaccination. To be able to get into this country, you got to show proof of vaccination. To leave the country, you got to blah, 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 all this sort of stuff. It's like, okay, maybe vaccines are a good thing in certain circumstances, but let's talk about that. Why is one group forcing that on everybody?
Yeah, what happened to my body, my choice?
Right. Right. Yeah, it's like, I mean, look, like but no one's.
But again, what about the HIPAA? Like, what about your HIPAA rights? So you have the ability to, like, if someone says you have a service dog, right, and they're not, because of your privacy, you're not allowed to ask them, well, yeah, what's your disability? You know what I mean? They can ask, are you disabled? Is that your dog? Is it working for you right now? You don't have to tell them what your disability is.
Right.
That's your private information. You know what I mean? How did that just all of a sudden get circumnavigated? And now, okay, well, privacy rights only matter unless it's for the COVID vaccine. Now that changes it. So for that, we're making a loophole. But if you want to come in, you have to do contact tracing and show vaccine, get a PCR test and all this stuff. But if you're coming across the border, you don't need to do any of that stuff. And we'll ship you all across the country, right? And we'll put you wherever. But in that case, you know, and it doesn't make any sense.
Just to go down a completely separate hole real quick, right? Like, look at the Department of Education, right? They're trying to implement, I think it was supposed to start August of this year, maybe September of this year, that they were going to implement that all schools must implement gender-neutral bathrooms. Under Chevron, your only recourse would have been to complain directly to the Department of Education that that's a problem. We as a school don't want gender-neutral bathrooms, right? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. But again, as a democracy, we should, at least on a local level, be able to decide for ourselves. If you initiated a lawsuit, right, if Chevron still existed, if you initiated a lawsuit in the local courts, the courts would have been bound by the Chevron Doctrine, and the courts would have also had to defer to the Department of Education's interpretation of what the Department of Education's powers were. If Chevron was never overturned, we can almost certainly predict that schools across the country would have been forced to implement gender-neutral bathrooms, and if they didn't, they would face crippling fines and or criminal prosecution by the Department of Education. And there's no one to complain. Think about, I'm not necessarily comparing agencies to small children, but think if you got a brother and a sister and they're fighting over a toy, and one of them's being a bully, right? What's the typical thing that, you know, they usually do? Like, Mom, Dad, they're pulling in the big guns now, right? That's the same thing with like a lawsuit. It's like, whoa, like, Mr. Agency, like, you can't, what are you doing? Like, who gave you that power? I'm going to go to the courts. Mom, Dad, I'm going to the courts. The courts are going to decide this for us. Under Chevron, the courts had to sit out. Or, well, okay, they weren't sitting out. And if you could see my hands, I'm making the bunny ears. They would allow to come in, and they were allowed to figure out the situation. But Chevron tied their hands and said, well, whatever the Department of Education or whatever the agency wants to do, we got to follow it.
Yeah. So you have an idea of how much tyranny and how much damage this and it's one of those things too where, like, maybe these things started with good intentions.
Yeah, for sure, as they always seem to do,
But then once you give government an inch, once you give people an inch, they want more and more and more, and the more power they get, right, and the more or the longer they operate under that power, the more pushback you're going to get to try to get it back. And that's why I was saying, like, normally to tell someone who's had 40 years of unchecked power that basically you have to relinquish the majority of this power that you have, because some of these rules and regulations have been actually officially approved.
Correct.
Many of them were just handled in-house. To get someone to relinquish that amount of power is without having to go to battle for it is pretty fascinating.
And here's the thing too, right? By Chevron being overturned, it doesn't mean these rules and regulations have crumbled in on themselves. They're still there, right? The TSA is still showing up to work. I'm sure there's still a sign that says interference with a TSA officer is punishable by blah, 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 right? Like, then they put them all throughout the lines as you're walking through. If you haven't noticed them, look now, you probably will, right? All that stuff is still there, and they're still going to enforce it. What now you can do is you can now get the courts involved. You can now challenge that authority through the courts. And the courts actually can get in and grapple with it and have a real legitimate say on it, right? Because before, courts are charged with interpreting the law so long as it fits within the confines of the Constitution. Agencies were then given that power through Chevron, and they were just play nice. Make sure you stay within the confines of the Constitution. We don't really have any power to come and check you if you get outside of those boundaries. Courts have to sit it out.
So what transpired to actually overthrow Chevron?
Sure. So it's one case, actually. It's not the transpiring of one case. It's many things that have chiseled away over Chevron over the last 40 years. We're going to skip over that for a second. The case that actually did overturn it, it's a case called Loper Bright Enterprises and versus Raimondo. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. The Secretary of Commerce. So specifically, and I'll go into the factual background because I think this does a really good job of, in my opinion, showing some substantial overreaching by one of the federal agencies. And here it is. Here's what happened. So specifically and again, I'm going to preface it with this. It's about fishing, and it's about overfishing the oceans around America, which is a legitimate concern, right? I'm not saying that's not a legitimate concern. The problem is the overreaching that occurred, and that is what the Supreme Court is saying is the issue. Yes, we should, and that's my opinion, that we should protect against overfishing. But to have one agency dictate how that happens, that's the issue. We all need to sit down and figure it out, or Congress does, and these experts, and then decide from a voting standpoint as to what we want to do as a society. So with that being said, to combat against overfishing around the U.S., Congress created the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation.
Yeah, did you ever even know that thing existed?
Right, exactly.
So that's what I was saying. How many of these agencies are out there that, like, we talk about the big ones, like the ATF, FBI, CIA. There's thousands and thousands of these. Like the thing you just read,
I had to read it. I had to read it. I didn't even know it existed.
I guarantee you no one listening to this had ever even heard of that before, unless you work in the fishing industry. No one's ever even heard of that before you're listening to this.
Right? So you got, and again, it's actually between two pages, so hold on a second. The Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation and Management Act was created in 1975. The National Marine Fisheries Service was tasked with administering the MSA. So again, a law was created, and then this agency, the National Marine Fisheries Service, and maybe you're familiar with it. If you're listening to this podcast and you're a fisherman, like, cool, I can see, like, I'm an idiot on the subject.
I've never heard of that.
Right, me neither, until I read this case. But besides that, here's the point, right? So the NMFS, the National Marine Fisheries Service, was tasked with administering this act about overfishing. under a delegation from the Secretary of Commerce. That's important. We're going to come back to that. Remember, under a delegation from the Secretary of Commerce. Okay, so the President of the United States appoints the Secretary of Commerce, and then the Secretary of Commerce delegates the NMFS to administer this Overfishing Act. Right, so now we're 2 tiers down on the delegation doctrine. So we go back to, again, the dissenting opinion. The opinion that says Chevron should never have been overturned is saying that you do have control over all this because you can vote for the president, right? But follow this chain here, and we're not done with this chain because I haven't even gotten to the people who are actually creating this law that's going to be an issue here in a second. The president appoints the Secretary of Commerce. The Secretary of Commerce then delegates this authority to the National Marine Fisheries Services, and then the National Marine Fisheries Services establishes 8 regional fishery management councils, which these councils develop fishery management plans, which the NMFS approves and promulgates as final regulations. The councils are in essence 3 tiers down on the delegation chain, and what they draft as management plans are then codified into regulations which the NMFS enforces. So, if you or anybody had a problem with these codes or regulations, can you unelect these council members? No, they were appointed, and they were appointed a few tiers down on the rung of who actually got elected. And this is it's called the delegation doctrine. How far is too far, right? Here, we're 3 or 4 tiers down on the delegation doctrine, but there's plenty of examples out there that go 6, 8, 12 tiers down on it. So it's like, who is this 12th person in line? How are they able to create this law, enforce this law, and then interpret this law however they want? Let alone, who is this person, and who's this person going to be in 4 years from now? If a new president comes in, or if a new governor comes in and they appoint all new people, it's probably pretty certain that council is going to get swiped and new people are going to get put in there, which is exactly back to the ATF situation that you described earlier. Chevron allows agencies to change course even when Congress has given them no power to do so. By its sheer breadth, Chevron fosters unwarranted instability in the law, leaving those attempting to plan around agency action in an internal fog of uncertainty. Right? These council members are specifically making these rules for the NMFS, and they're getting adopted and promulgated. What if you don't like them? Who do you complain to? Right? That's just food for thought.
That's kind of like what we're seeing right now with the schools, with these with having these books that are inappropriate and talk about sex and sexual acts with children like underneath 5th grade, and parents are trying to complain about it, and it just goes to like the school board, and then it never goes anywhere, and you're in this vicious cycle fighting the Department of Education. And it's like, how come the parents have no say in this? And at the end of the day, the Department of Education has these council people who are there allowing these books to be in the school, even though all the parents are saying, like, we don't want our kids having this sexualized material
right
in the freaking classroom. They're little kids, and the parents are basically
they have to complain
helpless because the Department of Education, they're fighting a battle where all the judge, jury, and the rule setters are all of the same organization. Right.
Now look at this. Like, look at this fishing thing. Right. The maybe right. So the National Marine Fisheries Service, we know it's been around since 1975. Well, okay, that was around the entire time Chevron was around too. It's been in existence even longer than Chevron was in existence, right? So maybe they had good intentions initially. And in fact, I think they did, because if you put together some of the dates, which I'm about to throw at you in a second, you're going to realize that things went vastly astray in just the last few years with this. And this is how this got challenged. So at the center of the issue in this most recent U.S. Supreme Court decision in Loper Bright Enterprises overturning Chevron was whether or not the National Marine Fisheries Service can require that domestic fishing vessels pay the salaries of one or more observers to be carried on board domestic vessels for the purpose of collecting data necessary for the conservation and management of the fishery. Okay, this is important because the dissent points to this, right? The people who are opposed to Chevron being overturned, and you see this in headlines and articles specifically saying judges think they're smarter than scientific experts, right? These observers, right, in theory, in a good interpretation of this theory, giving them everyone the benefit of the doubt, they're there to figure out what's being overfished, how we prevent that, and how to have a healthy fish population around America so that we can continue fishing for generations and not burn it out or whatever, right? And destroy the environment. Valid concern. Super valid concern. No one's saying, at least no one on this podcast is saying it's a bad thing. I don't know if there's anybody out there that hates fish, but anyways, it cost approximately $710 per day to have one observer on board of these vessels, and when all was said and done, it ate into about 20% of the fishing vessel's profits. And this is from the Supreme Court. So I'm not just making these numbers up. This is me regurgitating what the Supreme Court is saying through the facts that were presented to the Supreme Court. Okay? From the start of the MSA Act in 1975 up until 2020, so just 4 years ago, the National Marine Fisheries Service fully funded the mandatory observer coverage out of federal funding. So for the longest time, ever since before Chevron, they required these observers to be on these vessels.
But we were paying that through our taxes.
And we were paying it through taxes.
Yeah.
And they were collecting data, and they were figuring out what was overfished and what wasn't overfished, and blah, 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 right? In 2020, though, the National Marine Fisheries Service adopted the council's proposal. Okay, so we're back down to the councilmen who are now proposing to amend the regulations so that they required the fishermen to pay for the observers. The National Marine Fisheries Service adopted the council's proposal and approved this new rule into the National Marine Fisheries Service's regulations in 2020, which gave rise to the current lawsuit that took a few years. Again, the suit happened in 2020. The fishing companies have been affected for the last 4 years having to pay these guys salaries, and now in 2024 it finally got decided.
So if you wanted to run a fishing boat, you'd have to pay the salary of a person to come on the boat and watch you and make sure you're following the rules and to report back to the agency, right? You as a fisherman would now have to pay someone $710 a day to be on a boat that is not doing any fishing.
Yep. And what happened, so this particular company, if I understand it correctly, and I don't know much about fishing in this context, so I'm just regurgitating what the Supreme Court has relayed, but essentially, apparently when a vessel leaves to go out on a fishing expedition, they have to report into the National Marine Fisheries Service. And then the National Marine Fisheries Service decides, and statistically it turns out that about half, or a little bit more than half of all vessels that go out, they stop them and say, we're going to randomly select you to put an observer on your ship. And then now, if that's the case, that ship, that vessel has to pay that person's salary that the NMFS is forcing to be on that ship. It's important to note that Congress never authorized the National Marine Fisheries Service to force domestic fishermen to have to pay for mandatory observers.
Yeah.
The NMFS just went ahead and did it anyways. Congress did authorize the NMFS to charge foreign fishermen, right? So again, and not again because we didn't get into this, but there was an issue where apparently our sovereignty goes, I think, 12 miles out into the ocean, right? Mm-hmm. Well, apparently what was happening was all these foreigners were coming in to 13, 14 miles off the coast and just crushing the fish populations. So what this act did was extended that out to 200 miles, and now it's, if you want to come fish, you can, but we're going to put an observer on you, and you have to pay for it if you're a foreigner. And Congress specifically said they can do that. So that's not being challenged. What's being challenged is our domestic vessels are now heading out into these waters and want to fish. And for the first 25 years, our government paid for it, our tax dollars
Yeah.
paid for it. But now the councilmen are saying, you know what? Why don't we just save this money and use it elsewhere? I don't know if they gave themselves salaries increases or what. I have no idea what happened to that money that they quote unquote saved or spent elsewhere. But now they're saying, you know what? The domestic guys are going to pay for it too, even though they had no specific authority to do so. Now, Congress was silent. Right, this is important. Congress was silent as to whether or not the National Marine Fisheries Service could charge domestic fishermen with having to pay the salary of mandatory observers. So they didn't say they couldn't do it, but they didn't specifically say you could.
So since they were silent, going back to how the Chevron Doctrine just gave them carte blanche on silence, meaning, okay, then you can determine whatever you want because they didn't say you could or couldn't, so that means you can decide if you can or can't.
Yep. And if you want to have a court, if you want to challenge the agency's interpretation to a court, the court has to defer to the agency's interpretation.
Interesting thing, and this is could be a stretch, but a lot of the dissent is saying like this opens up by not having the Chevron Act. It opens up the ability for fraud and abuse and whatnot, and corporate fraud. But as I'm listening to this and you're thinking about, the year 2020 and all the things that have been happening through the time of COVID and how big government has basically, or big corporations have come in and basically through the mandates of all these different agencies, like remember you had the cows and the chickens and the pigs. And during the whole COVID thing and the lockdowns, they ordered farmers to cull thousands of cows, thousands of pigs, right, to clear their farms, right, to pour out millions of gallons of milk, and then all this stuff basically put these farmers out of business. And then during the time frame, someone like Bill Gates buys up 80% of all the private farms. Yeah. You could look at this and go, if you're following that same track record of the monopolization of our food industry, you could look at that and go, these agencies are forcing fishermen to accrue, more expenses to put the small fishermen out of business. Because if you're a small fisherman, dude, $700 something a day. Yeah. To have someone on your boat and it's mandatory, like that's a big deal. Like that's probably more than they're paying. That probably pays for like 3 dudes on the boat or 2 dudes on the boat. Yeah. You know what I mean?
They said it ate into about 20% of their profit.
20% of their profit, right?
Overnight, right? Like that was for 25 years. If you're a family business and you've been operating for 25 years, now all of a sudden they're forcing you to pay this person's salary, and you don't have a choice.
That's crazy.
Yeah, and it ate into 20% of your profit. I mean, that's 20% of your income. The Supreme Court obviously overturned Chevron here, but let's talk about what the lower courts did, because obviously you can't just go straight to the Supreme Court. You got to start at the lowest level and then work your way up, right? Well, all of the lower courts on this particular case essentially followed the Chevron Doctrine, as almost all courts have done since 1984. And these lower courts deferred to the National Marine Fisheries Services Agency's interpretation of what their powers were, even when this was silent, even though there was no specific statute that gave them the ability to do this. The lower courts followed Chevron, and they said, cool, if that's your interpretation, awesome, right? Well, I want to go back real quick to the 10th Amendment, and the 10th Amendment specifically states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So it's kind of a two-way street here, because the 10th Amendment, the 10th Amendment is pretty much dead at this point, but the way that works, obviously, and I keep harping this, is unless it was specifically given to the government, it's retained by the people. But here, this National Marine Fisheries Service, the ability to charge the domestic fishermen with having to pay these people, these observers, these mandatory observer salaries, that was never specifically given to them, but they interpreted it that way, so we have to let them do that. Is really what the lower courts did. The lower courts reasoned that since Congress was silent as to whether or not the NMFS can force domestic fishermen to pay for mandatory observers, that gave rise to an ambiguity in the law. Therefore, the courts must defer to however the National Marine Fisheries Services wanted to interpret that ambiguity. The NMFS, of course, interpreted Congress's silence as broad power for the National Marine Fisheries Service to charge whomever and whatever they wanted. Chevron demands that courts mechanically afford binding deference to agency interpretations, including those that have been inconsistent over time. Right? I'm going to read that again. And this is specifically from Lober-Bright Enterprises, the Supreme Court opinion that overturned Chevron. The Supreme Court specifically said that Chevron demands that courts mechanically afford binding deference to agency interpretations, including those interpretations that have been inconsistent over time.
So that means if you are having one rule 1 year and then next year you change the rule and you keep going back and forth, it doesn't matter how many times you change it, you can just change it when you feel like doing it.
Yep. And as we know, science changes all the time, so the agency's interpretation would change all the time. And specifically, the Lober-Bright Enterprise, the opinion states that, again, I'll harp this, Chevron allows agencies to change course even when Congress has given them no power to do so. By its sheer breadth, Chevron fosters unwarranted instability in the law, leaving those attempting to plan around agency action in an internal fog of uncertainty.
Yeah. And this is something like, again, you're not working in the fishing industry, but this way of conducting your business, like, that's not a tax. They don't count that when they go, oh, how much are Americans taxed? They don't count that as a tax, right? But that's a you're forced to pay that. And I remember when we were doing the cabin here on the property, and we wanted to close off a porch and make a porch have walls, so it's now inside the house. It was underneath the roof line. The roof already extended out. It had the pillars and all that stuff. So we weren't adding anything to the foundation. We're just going to take a porch and make the porch enclosed. The zoning department and the county forced me to hire a septic company and have a septic guy come out, drain our septic tank, do an inspection of the septic tank before they would approve me closing off the corner of the house, which was a porch, and now it's making indoors. You know what I mean? But that's not a tax. But like they're like, okay, well, you're not getting a building permit. You can't do this until you do that.
Right.
And then they would do other things too. But like,
who do you complain to?
Who do you complain to? You can't complain to anyone. But
Right.
they're forcing you to spend money, and for them to then look over the documentation, it's part of the permit process. So the county just got $80 to $175 to review my paperwork showing that I got the septic tank drained and inspected, and they give you this whole laundry list of things to do. But again, it's like, who do you complain to? You know what I mean? But that doesn't count as a tax.
Right.
But they're forcing you to conduct your daily life. They're forcing you to, and they'll just change it. Who came up with it being $175?
Right.
Who came up with that?
Who came up with getting the permit for that specific issue in the first place?
Yeah, why do I need to check this? You know, I'm not adding bedrooms. I'm not, like, that. Me closing off a porch doesn't say that there's going to be more people living in the house.
And maybe, again, back to this, right? Maybe that's the right conclusion to come to. Maybe it's an appropriate conclusion to come to that, yeah, maybe we should have people get permits for this, and maybe we should have them pay $175 or whatever it is because it's justified under these circumstances, right? But again, for one agency to just dictate that,
yeah,
and you have no way of challenging it, that is in essence that is tyranny.
Yeah, but
right?
they're also deciding what the price is. Like, they got to, like, when you're reading that, they got to decide hey, we want our guys to get paid $710 a day.
Yeah.
Tough shit.
Yeah.
You want to be a fisherman? This is the cost of doing business.
Right? So that right there, right? That sets up the tipping point for the United States Supreme Court to then overrule those lower courts and strike down Chevron entirely, essentially saying that Chevron was, quote unquote, wrongly decided. Rather, per Section 706 of the Administrative Procedure Act, right, the APA, which was passed back in, I think, 1945 or 1946, which we talked about earlier in the podcast, the courts shall decide all relevant questions of law, not agencies. The courts get to determine what an ambiguous statute means. Now, the courts again get to determine if a statute is silent on a particular thing. The courts interpret what that silence means, not the agencies anymore. Huge shift in power. Huge shift in power. Because now these fish, in which they did and they won, right? These fishing people, or throw in anything that you can think of in this situation. Now, if there's an ambiguity and if an agency is overreaching, before you'd have to complain to the agency. And the agent, you'd be like, hey, you can't do that. And you're like, the agency's like, yeah, we can. We say we can. And the courts would have to allow them to do that. They'd have to defer to their interpretation of it. And it was wishy-washy depending on who was in the administration at that time, right? Now, you and everyone else can go to the court and challenge whatever the agency is you think is maybe overreaching, and the court gets to decide for that agency. And it's going to hopefully be a lot more in line with the Constitution and with basic statutory construction of how laws are supposed to be read.
That's awesome. That's great news for the American people.
Yeah, except for if you hate the decision, right? Again, a lot of these people are like, well, these observers are experts, and we need them because we need to know what's being overfished. No one's saying we don't need observers. No one's saying we shouldn't study the effects of overfishing, and no one's saying we shouldn't have regulations for fishing, right? Now, agencies must use their power to persuade, not their power to control. As Chevron itself noted, ambiguities may result from an inability on the part of Congress to squarely answer the question at hand, or from a failure to even consider the question with the requisite precision. In neither case does an ambiguity necessarily reflect a congressional intent that an agency, as opposed to a court, resolve the resulting interpretive question. And many or perhaps most statutory ambiguities may be unintentional. As the framers recognized, ambiguities will inevitably follow from the complexity of objects, the imperfection of the human faculties, and the simple fact that no language is so copious as to supply words and phrases for every complex idea. The only way to ensure that the law will not merely change erratically, but will develop in a principled and intelligible fashion, is for us to leave Chevron behind. Courts must now exercise their independent judgment in deciding whether an agency has acted within its statutory authority as the APA requires. Careful attention to the judgment of the executive branch may help inform that inquiry, and when a particular statute delegates authority to an agency consistent with constitutional limits, courts must respect the delegation while ensuring that the agency acts within it. But courts need not, and under the APA may not, defer to an agency interpretation of the law simply because a statute is ambiguous. That's the newest Supreme Court ruling on what they said.
That's great. And the thing is to when they're saying like leave Chevron behind, I think Chevron never should have been adopted to begin with. You know what I mean? Like,
back to what you were saying before, right? Like, I really think it was adopted with good intentions, right? Even Justice Scalia, right? The infamous Justice Scalia, the late Scalia now, he was in fact an early champion of Chevron. However, a few years after it came out, he came to serious doubt whether it could be reconciled with the APA, the Administrative Procedures Act. For its entire existence, Chevron has been a rule in search of a justification, if it was ever coherent enough to be called a rule at all. right? Ambiguity is a term that we may have different meanings for between different judges. One judge might see ambiguity everywhere. Another might not ever encounter it, right? And these are things that the Supreme Court is saying in this case. These are actual quotes from this particular Supreme Court opinion, right? Ambiguity is a rule of law that is wholly in the eye of the beholder. It invites different results in like cases and is therefore arbitrary in practice. Such an impressionistic and malleable concept cannot stand as an everyday test for allocating interpretive authority between courts and agencies. So if an agency said this was ambiguous, the agency's view controlled, and the agency got to interpret what that ambiguity meant, which exactly gave rise to instability in the law, leaving those attempting to plan around agencies' action in an eternal fog of uncertainty. You had no idea. Maybe the rule is going to be read it's not going to impede your business for the next few years, but Lord knows what 2 more years or 4 more years down the road, whoever's going to interpret that, I don't know how they're going to interpret that, and they may come in and say that because I left my firearm here and I had a suppressor on it, and this other dude standing next to me, he's in constructive possession of it.
Yeah, you see a lot of this going on in like where this can go to. So let's just look at this thing with the fishery. Like, let's say that went on for 4 years.
Yeah.
So who's to say that other agencies don't start saying, "Hey, you know what?" And they probably do this. They probably do this with the other farms. Like, you have to have this inspector come out. I know like they have food inspectors and code inspectors, and and you got to pay for them to come out and do an inspection. That's not, the business has to do that. And it's like, dude, do we want the food inspected? Like, make sure that the restaurant's operating, a good way. Like, I'm not saying that it shouldn't be, right? But if you start putting that in and there's no set rules and you can just start charging whatever you want. And one of the things that we're seeing over in and again, this is a different country, right? But a lot of these countries are ahead of us in a lot of this stuff, right? America still in some ways has some of those freedoms still more in check. But in Germany, with this whole green push, they're saying in the next couple of years, your house has to be what they call zero emissions. And if it's not, right, and some of these houses are going to cost 50,000 euros or 150,000 euros to convert a home to be zero emissions. And if you don't, then you have to pay fines. And if you don't do it within 5 years after the end date, then they can remove you from your home. So it's like you have a home that you already paid for, you bought it, and now they're like, oh yeah, you have to go change the windows, you can't use gas anymore, you got to do this, you can't burn wood, you got to change these roofs, you got to put this insulation in, and they're just making this. Some dude comes in and goes, yeah, dude, this is what we're doing now. Yeah, exactly. And it's like now you actually have an ability to try to challenge that. Yeah. Now the question is did the legislature specifically delegate that task and that authority to that person who's trying to do that? Yeah. But the same thing with that, you go, okay, well, these are the experts. Okay, well, we've heard trust the science. Now all this information's coming out that, okay, the scientists said you had to wear the mask and 6 feet. Years later, Fauci's saying that, okay, I just kind of arbitrarily came up with 6 feet. Oh, the masks don't actually work, but you told us they did. Well, science changes. Think about all the people who got arrested. I remember this. We brought this up in the last podcast. This guy got arrested for swimming in the ocean off of one of the Carolinas, I think. I forget which state. Yeah. I just think I remember that. California, too. There you go. Yeah, and it's like, who that's science? Yeah. Okay, why didn't we talk about that? Why didn't we have our elected officials debate this? These are the experts. These are the experts saying that children who are infants should be getting 70-something vaccines in the first couple of years of their life. Those are the experts, but those experts are also getting paid by those corporations and all that stuff. So when you start looking at this stuff, you're like, but this is all being forced. How many people went out of business people missed, weren't. You were told you couldn't go see your family member. Like, I saw that video coming out of like the UK or something, and they were at like their family member's funeral, and that one person came over and sat down to the other family member to condole them, and some security guard police officer comes walking up and is like, "Hey, you 6 feet," and pushes them away and removes the two mourning, family members.
Yeah.
Okay, so you guys can live in the same freaking house, but you can't sit next to each other at a funeral. Like, 6 feet in the lobby of the airport, but you can sit right next to the dude on the airplane. Wear the mask unless you're eating. Like, who the hell comes up with this shit?
And who could you challenge at the time?
Yeah.
How could you challenge it?
But these are the experts.
Yeah. And their biggest thing is, well, you don't have to fly. You don't have to fly on an airplane.
Yep.
If you don't want to wear a mask, don't fly on an airplane. Well, that's weird because we have a constitutional right to travel. You're not allowed to impede it. So now you got an agency that's impeding your constitutional right to travel by forcing you to have to wear a mask. Well, it's just a little, it's for the safety. The science shows that these masks are going to stop. Okay, maybe the science does show that, but show us the science that shows it. Persuade us that we all need to wear masks on an airplane. I'm not saying we shouldn't wear masks on an airplane. I'm just saying persuade us that your opinion is right. Right? The power to persuade versus the power to control. This Loper Bright Enterprises specifically speaks to this issue. Before, under Chevron, the agencies had the full power to control. They didn't have to persuade you. They told you how it was going to be. And you couldn't, you had no material way of challenging that. Now, specifically, and I'll quote this from the Loper Bright Enterprises case, in an agency case in particular, the court will go about its tasks now with the agency's body of experience and informed judgment, among other information, at its disposal. And although an agency's interpretation of a statute cannot bind a court, it may be especially informative to the extent it rests on factual premises within the agency's expertise. Such expertise has always been one of the factors which may give an executive branch interpretation particular power to persuade if lacking power to control. So they're specifically recognizing, when you see these articles coming out from the LA Times or whoever saying the Supreme Court thinks it's smarter than scientific experts. No, they're never saying that. They've never said that. They're never saying don't follow the science. They're never saying science is bullshit. They never say that anywhere. They say, now, if you want us to follow your rules, come and persuade us. Show us your facts. Show us your evidence. Maybe you're right.
Yeah. I still remember talking about the persuasion, right? Is this the irony of the people who are saying that this was good for them to be able to do this stuff, right? And like these because everyone goes to experts and trust the science. They love using that to basically gaslight you into oppressing yourself.
Yep.
I still remember it was like Marlboro or Camel, right? I forget the company, but I remember the ads. It was like, the number one cigarette choice of doctors.
Yeah.
And like your doctor's number one cigarette choice. And it was like they were promoting smoking and saying that it was healthy, it was good for you, dude, they had my mom, when she was in high school, they smoked in school. And I remember the old planes, like they were still around when we were young and traveling. The armrests inside planes had freaking ashtrays in them, and cars had ashtrays in them.
Now I remember there's just like dried gum stuck in there now.
Yeah, yeah. That's they would always get that. But it wasn't even until too long ago that all cars came with a cigarette lighter and an ashtray. Right. But at that time, those same Food and Drug Administration and these people who were the scientists and the experts told everyone that cigarettes were perfectly fine for you, that they were actually great, and you should have no problem. And these are the same people then are, promoting us that high fructose corn syrup is great. You know what? Yeah. Canola oil is a better alternative than butter. You know what I mean? There,
Right.
you look at they just debunked the food pyramid. My entire childhood growing up, you had the food pyramid. And now they're saying, dude, the food pyramid is completely wrong.
Yeah.
This is creating more health disasters, right? All these seed oils and all these synthetic versions of food are causing such health issues. But these are all being pushed forward and enforced, right? And regulated by the same companies that were getting all their power through this same Chevron Doctrine.
Yeah, and to that point exactly, I'll quote Loper Bright Enterprises, right? 4 decades after Chevron's inception, Chevron has thus become an impediment rather than an aid to accomplishing the basic judicial task of saying what the law is. Chevron has not been the sort of stable background role that fosters meaningful reliance. If you relied on the food pyramid your entire life to realize that that whole thing's been turned on its head now, and if we let experts dictate what we have to intake as far as foods on a daily level, right, that would be disastrous, right? That would be horrific, or any of these examples, right? If we let these experts control us in this regard, well, the science changes all the time. We've seen that.
Yeah, they're trying to do it right now with all this lab-grown meat. Bill Gates is out there trying to convince everyone that lab-grown meat is a better source of protein. It's healthier, right? And they're making all this synthetic, shit.
Right. And imagine if they forced that on you.
Yeah, they were trying to.
Yeah. And Chevron would have let them.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's super frustrating. And again, right? Again, back to we're not. By no means am I saying scientists are wrong. By no means am I saying don't trust experts. Right? That's not the message that's getting pushed here. Because obviously you want to eat healthy. We want to know what healthy food is. We want to figure that out. We want to have a healthy debate over that. We don't want to overfish the oceans. We don't want to overhunt the woods. We don't want to overpollute the rivers. We don't want to overpollute the air. Right? But what is pollution? What do we define as pollution? What's an acceptable level? What's not an acceptable level? Maybe there's no acceptable level. But where as a society do we stand on this? Why do we have one agency under one roof tell us what it is, and we have no way of questioning it and no way of challenging it?
What did NBC, what was their article? What did they say?
MSNBC?
Yeah.
Their headline was Massive Power Grab by SCOTUS. SCOTUS being the Supreme Court of the United States, throws out decades of established law. Right? That was their headline. That was like
very, very misleading headline.
Very misleading headline. First off, let's talk about it, right? So MSNBC recognizes that there's a lot of power that was just grabbed. Well, if it was grabbed back by SCOTUS, the Supreme Court of the United States, that inherently means that the agencies had all that massive power.
Yeah.
So first off, if you're going to grab a massive amount of power, it's got to be from somewhere. And if they grabbed it from the agencies, that means the agencies had a massive amount of power. And then let's go to the second part of that headline. SCOTUS throws out decades of established law. Okay, it's 40 years old. But what about Chevron? What did it do to the 208 years of established law prior to Chevron? It completely turned that on its head. Nobody was bitching about that.
Yeah, they're like, well, we've had it for 40 years. We can't not have it because it's been decades. But it's like, dude, you had centuries of established law before you slipped this thing in and just let it metastasize into this huge overbearing monstrosity that just put, tyranny across every single aspect of our entire lives.
Yeah. And look, these are really, at the end of the day, these are surface level, emotionally drawn responses designed to stir emotions amongst uninformed people, right? By labeling things and gaslighting it or calling it science or gaslighting you and saying that, you trust the science, how dare you, blah, 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 you're killing people by not wearing a mask. All those things aren't constitutionally based arguments. All it is emotionally based arguments, right? The dissent tries and grab uninformed people to support the dissenting opinion. Chevron allowed unelected officials to create, enforce, and interpret laws, even when a law was silent as to what that power given to that particular agency was, completely contrary to the 10th Amendment, and also to the Administrative Procedure Act, and also the entire way our government was originally separated into 3 branches of government for the first 208 years. It was completely contrary to all of that. Now, again, it's it's been almost an entire generation of us living under Chevron. I've never known any different.
No, you don't know any different. Just like our kids don't know any different when they have grown up the people who have been around in the last 15 years, they've become accustomed to they're constantly being filmed, that there's security cameras on houses, there's security cameras on stores, there's cameras on traffic lights, there's cameras at the government, there's cameras everywhere. You know what I mean? So when you hear something like, oh, if you have nothing to hide, like we want to see this or know this about you. If you don't have anything to hide, what are you worried about? And understanding that like you have the right to privacy, but when you've grown up in a generation where everything is being recorded, you don't even realize that there was a time when people had privacy and you weren't trying to hide anything. It's just, dude, this is none of your business. You know what I mean? Now everything's like, hey, it's everybody's business. Everything about your life, given even what you had for breakfast, lunch, and everything like that, everything's everyone's business, and you need to share it all the time, and it's just expected at this point. It's kind of like the same thing with this. Us living under this type of, government usage, right? Or the way that they've been handling themselves. You have the idea that you're living in this free country, but subconsciously everyone is like, dude, we're really not that free.
Right.
I don't understand how this is land of the free, home of the brave, but it just doesn't seem like it makes sense because people like, I have lots of people who come here from other countries to train, and they're like, America's amazing. Man, you guys have like as many rules and all this stuff as we do. In fact, some of the people who come here from other countries are like, wow, you guys are way more strict than where we are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought America was like the home of the free.
Back to my situation in the Geneva airport where they were just selling knives right before you got on the plane. Like, it was just like, they looked at me weird that I was looking at them weird. They're like, what do you mean? You're like, of course you sell knives before you get on airplanes, It's like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting, right? Well, most notably, though, the dissent in Loper Bright Enterprises doesn't attempt at all to explain how Chevron is a form of democracy or even republic, right? They dance around that issue. They really pin it down on the fact that, they're looking at this, especially the LA Times, the MSNBC, and all these people are like, judges are not experts in these fields. We need to rely on these experts. Okay, well, you're not explaining to me how this is a democratic way of doing it. You're not explaining to me how this is a way of doing it that's confined within the boundaries of our Constitution. Maybe the experts are right. Maybe they have a very valid reason and very valid evidence to support their reason. But why and how can they dictate to us how we are going to operate? Right? Well, look at it again, back to COVID-19. If your science is so good, then why not just prove it? Why not persuade us? As opposed to force us to agree with you and belittle us if we oppose you. Right? History has shown us that science has changed so much over time, right? Dr. Fauci was the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we all know how tyrannical our system became during those times. And as just you stated earlier, right? I mean, they're coming out now. Where'd this 6-foot rule come from? Oh, we just kind of made it up. What do you mean, you're an expert? Where's the facts? Where's the facts behind this?
Yeah, then when he has in one video is saying that we need to do a mask and separate 6 feet, and you're safe if you have the vaccine. Then next one is like, okay,
if you have the vaccine, you'll never get COVID. I distinctly remember them coming. That was the very first thing they did.
And then because he flip-flopped on all this stuff. Everyone, it was like, you need to wear the mask. Then you need to wear the mask just indoors. You don't need it outdoors. It was all these different. Every couple months it changed. And his take on it later on was, science changes. And it's like, okay, so one minute you're telling me trust the science. The next minute you're saying science changes, right? But where's the data that you're pulling this stuff? And the thing of it is there was no data. So, you have a lot of people who, and he basically at one point said that he is the science. He's like, you got to trust me. if you don't trust me, you don't trust science.
Yeah.
Or if you don't believe in me, you don't believe in science. And again, like you're talking about, like there's no data. Show me the scientific data. Let me see the fucking the pie chart or the graph where it shows the mask stops this thing, that blah 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 at the distance of 6 feet, because if you cough or you breathe, particles only travel so far, or they're in a potency that can be not absorbed, or blah blah blah. Like where is this? How did you come to that conclusion? And there is nothing. But
they won't even go there, right? They won't even go there. Their response a lot of the times, right? And I got this. I'm sure you got this. A lot of the typical responses when me or anyone would propose a logical question like that, the responses was, "You're a conspiracy theorist, like
and you're selfish,
right? You're killing a lot of people by not wearing this mask." Again, I don't want to kill anybody. Right? If I need to wear a mask, prove to me I'll wear a mask. I'm not above wearing a mask, but why? Prove it to me. Don't tell me I have to and then shame me if I don't. You know what I'm saying? It's like, okay, if by me not wearing a mask is going to go out and kill people because I'm going to spread COVID-19, I don't want to do that. So let's if we want to make this a rule, then let's go ahead, present the evidence, convince us that we all need to wear masks. Go ahead. The floor is yours, right? And that was, they would never go down that road. The road was, you how dare you question the science? You think you're smarter than the science? You think you're smarter than the scientists? No, I'm not. No. I'm a human being. Like,
we know we're the ones who created it.
Right. Right. It's like, they can draw surface level arguments like, well, if you catch all the fish, you're gonna overfish and you're gonna destroy the fish population. Well, no shit. So yeah, we probably need to regulate that. But like, why are we paying this guy's salary? Like, I thought the federal government was going to pay for that. Like, why are you forcing me to pay this guy's salary? It's like, these are the types of things. They get down in these little nooks and crannies, right? From the Chevron Doctrine, it works. It's all the way down to a fishing vessel from the National Marine Fisheries thing all the way to 2020, about $710 a day. Like, that's the tip of the spear on the Chevron Doctrine in that specific agency. You can look at any agency and all the little nooks and crannies they've worked their fingers into. And it's like, are they even allowed to be there? Why are they here? Maybe they are. Maybe they're allowed to be here. Maybe they came to the right conclusion by being here. Maybe they're in the worst. Maybe they came to a horrible conclusion and they're forcing it on us anyways. These are the types of things we are going to have to, as a society, grapple with these now, right? Unfortunately, what I think is going to happen is, what I know has just happened is there's a huge power void that's just been created by the overturning Chevron. There's a huge power void that just, a vacuum that just occurred. I don't think most people know about it. I know the government knows about it because they're the ones that got stripped of the power. Typically what happens whenever there's a huge void in power is usually they'll start working their fingers back into it somehow, way, shape, or form and try to grab it again, right? And that's unfortunately a scary thing that I think we're going to probably see over the next few years, maybe the next few days or weeks or months, or I don't know. You're going to see, I don't think any of these agencies are going to operate any differently right now.
Yeah, and they're probably going to try to start convincing us that we need them and that we should allow them to have these authorities and all that kind of stuff. And I think that becomes a very important, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this episode with you is like, we need to know what our rights are and how the rights were being violated in this unconstitutional, power grab originally. And now we need to basically fight to put the right people in power to keep this thing in check. You know what I mean? Like, if parents are upset with the Department of Education, this is the opportunity to get the Department of Education in check. If you're in the 2A community and you're having problems with the ATF, because the ATF, again, originally the ATF was designed to go after people who are illegally selling guns. The ATF agent that helped me get my FFL set up for the company, she's like, when she came into it, 20, 30 years ago, she's like, we were focused on getting the bad guys, and we worked in partnership with gun stores and gun companies and the people who had the FFLs, like your federal firearms license, right? Like a dealer. She's like, because those are the ones who are doing it by the book. So my job, this is her speaking, when working with someone like you who's setting up a gun store, my job was to educate you and help you navigate how to do this legally and go after the bad guys and take them to court, for the crimes they've committed. Now she's like, I'm retiring. I'm getting out of this. She's like, she's like, now we're not so much tasked with going after the bad guys as much as they're being essentially what we would call weaponized to go find people who have gun shops, right? We're trying to push back against the Second Amendment, right? We want to disarm the population, but we have to figure out how to do it. So now these agents are going to gun shops and people who have FFLs, and they're going, hey man, it's an $1,100 fine if you filled out like your paperwork and you forgot to check if you were male or female or whatever, right? Or for example, they have a new form that has non-binary, male, female, non-binary. If I used the old form when it was just male or female and didn't give you the option to do non-binary, then that's an $1,100 fine. If someone forgot to put in a phone number or forgot to check a box or whatever, per violation, per discrepancy, it would be like $1,100 fine. And then basically they do an audit of all the gun transactions and all this stuff. And basically, you forgot to put this here, you forgot to do this, that, instead of checking yeah, dude, okay, they didn't check if they were white Caucasian or white Hispanic, white non-Hispanic or whatever. They basically come in and be like, hey, dude, we just overlooked your stuff. You have 16 violations. You're going to owe us, $17,600. Or if you can't pay that, then we're going to have to shut down your FFL. So now you're in this position where it's like, dude, there's no guns missing.
Yeah.
We have full accountability of everything.
Right.
But you have these little tiny clerical errors, which have been remedied. We looked into it. The guns are all everything's legit.
Right.
But now they're nitpicking and how do you challenge that?
Right.
But again, the agency in the beginning was set up to help fight crime.
Right.
And now it's being targeted against people who are law-abiding citizens, right? And challenging the same things happening with the IRS.
It goes back to the whole thing that we were talking about in one of the other podcasts, right? I think it was in the last one, right? We are at this point, if Chevron was decided in 1984, I would dare to say that essentially a government job span is about 20 to 30 years. Somebody's going to be in an agency for 20 to 30 years, maybe longer in some instances, but I think that's probably around when pensions start kicking in, people get out and then they go do something else and then they get their pension and everything like that, right? Well, if we're looking at it that way, the people that were in charge of these agencies back in 1984, they're pretty much almost certainly all long gone out of those agencies at this point, right? I'm sure maybe there's a few still hanging around, but by and large, most of them are gone. And then the group that came in after them, if we're following the 20 to 30 year rule, most of those guys and girls are long gone too. And now we're into a new generation, if you will, right? So you're born into this system. We've never been shown or taught anything different. We're not used to anything different, right? And it kind of begs the question again of what if you thought you were fighting to uphold freedom, but instead we're protecting those who are advancing tyranny?
Yeah. I mean, look at all these videos coming out of James O'Keefe with all this hidden camera stuff. There's hundreds of videos that he has where they have people working for, in many cases, big corporations, but there's a lot of people who are working for government agencies that exposing how they're using the agencies to manipulate and push forward different agendas, whether it's the DEI stuff or it's, different mandates or all the stuff we've been talking about.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And
Well,
these are all these like young
absolutely
people who think like socialism's cool.
Or even if they don't think socialism is cool, right? Like, well, we're doing it for national security. Okay, yeah, national security is a good topic. We should talk about national security. But the manner and how we go about doing it, are we going to go do it in a tyrannical way? Or are we going to do it in a democratic or a republic way? We all agree that we should secure our nation. Well, I think most of us agree that, right? I don't know who's listening to this podcast. But, if we all agree that we should secure our nation, awesome. Let's do it the right way. Let's not do it in a tyrannical way. Let's not do it by saying, yeah, you know what, we're gonna just collect everyone's electronic data that gets submitted through the internet, whether or not it's secured or not, we're just gonna collect it all. Okay, that's a violation of the Fourth Amendment. Tell me how it's not, right? And they never explain how it's not. They're just like, well, the Supreme Court says you can do it now. Well, no, that's not. You're not telling me how it's how you're able to navigate around the Fourth Amendment, right? All you're telling me is that you're doing it because it's in the interest of national security, right? Okay.
That goes back into the thing. Well, if you don't have anything to hide, what do you care?
Right.
And
all those are surface level arguments. Those are all surface level arguments. Back to this, if we're going to have a constitution to set the parameters, we shouldn't be able to pick and choose when the government's going to follow it, right? And maybe that's a good thing, maybe that's a bad thing, right? Again, agencies can act a hell of a lot quicker than Congress or the legislature can in a lot of these circumstances, right? You go back to Pearl Harbor when we got attacked by Japan, we had to act quick. Right? It took a while before war was actually declared. That's probably a bad thing from a national security standpoint. So we got to find this healthy balance between the two, right? We were training CQB earlier in the day, and the one thing that close quarter, like the room clearing stuff earlier today, and by no means am I even remotely I wouldn't even consider myself moderate on that. But in that other event, you kept bringing up this thing, and correct me if I'm wrong, it's if you're going to go. But if you're not,
don't.
Right?
So you're going to go dynamic and go all in?
Yeah.
Or you're going to go slow, methodical, and take it as it is.
And I see the same thing with the Constitution. If we're going to follow it, follow it. If you're not. But we better figure out a system we can all agree on. Yeah. As opposed to picking and choosing, maybe, well, we're going to get around the Fourth Amendment for this. The 10th Amendment, we're just going to ignore that. I mean, I don't even want to try to reconcile that if I was the government.
That's where you hear some of them say, like, oh, well, they didn't know when they did the Second Amendment that we're going to have these weapons of war, right? But then again, you're like, okay, well, when they're talking about the printing press, they didn't know we were going to have Twitter.
We can do this all day long.
You know what I mean? Like, so you can't pick
exactly.
and choose when you want to use them. You know
exactly.
What I mean?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's they're surface level arguments, and it's like you really got to get and grapple with this stuff, to say that, well, the Second Amendment only applies to the weapons at the time the Second Amendment was passed. Cool. Well, if you're going to use that argument, you better apply it to the rest of the Constitution too, since then the First Amendment only applies to printing presses. Then and it doesn't apply to your phone, doesn't apply to your computer or anything like that. So it's again, if you're going to go. If you're not. Don't.
Yep, because when you play in the middle ground, that's when all the bad stuff happens.
Yep.
So, that's interesting. What do you think? I kind of said my piece on, I think this is really important for people to understand because they're going to try to take it back.
Sure.
They're going to try to get this power back. They don't want to give it up. No one ever wants to give up the power that they've had, especially if they've had it for 40 years. Like you mentioned, the people that we entrusted with this in the beginning are not the same people who are still there running the show.
Correct.
It's a new breed, or not a new breed, but it's a new generation, a new line of people who are in there, you know what I mean, who might not be as honest as and with the same intentions of, some people look at this and go, oh man, look at all the ways we can leverage this. Right? And
yeah,
they look
that's dangerous
and
thing.
And they look
right
at
there.
The Constitution as something to work around. Like,
yep.
How do we work around this?
How do we catch this bad guy?
Yeah.
How can I skirt this and still catch this bad guy?
Yeah.
And we've
Or how do we get more tax revenue?
Right.
How do we use this and leverage it so we can get more revenue because we got this other project that we want to do and whatnot. So my takeaway from this is, one, understanding what our rights are to begin with and how they were violated. And now that the ball is back in our court, how do we maintain that ball, and keep those liberties that made America a free country, right? How do we keep that? What are some of your thoughts for everyone listening, kind of moving forward, like now that we understand this,
sure,
and we understand how bad that was, and like, holy shit, we were just in this super toxic relationship and we just had this breakup, like, oh man, now let's look back at how toxic was this whole mess.
Yeah.
Hey, are we going to walk back into another toxic relationship, or are we going to get our shit straight?
So first off, I'd say, don't be distressed with any surface level arguments you may get thrown in your face, right? Like, how dare you not want to trust the science? How dare you think you're smarter than a scientist, right? Like, all these sorts of things, they're just designed to belittle. They're just designed to try to oppress you, right? Unless it specifically addresses how it navigates safely through the Constitution without violating it, it's all bullshit as far as I'm concerned, right? It's all designed to just belittle you or shut you up or try to intimidate you so that you just back down and walk away, and then they're the louder voice in the room, right? So don't be intimidated by that. Two, you got to really pay attention to who's in the legislature right now. The legislature has a history, and I'm not saying this is right or wrong. The legislature has a history of just kicking the can over to the agency, saying, you know what, I don't know much about fishing, but we got to do something about it, so we're going to have these guys over here, the National Marine Fishery Agency, figure it out. Okay? All right, maybe that's a good thing. Probably is a good thing, right? But what kind of authority are they going to delegate to it? Are they just going to tell them straight up now that they can go ahead and force domestic vessels to have mandatory observers on board and they have to pay their salaries? Okay, well, these legislators are elected. They're elected officials. So why are we going to do that? Confront them about this sort of stuff, right? This specific example, sure, but any example. Talk to, like that. They're at the forefront now. It's in their hands again to decide what they want to do with it. I'm concerned that they're just going to say, you know what, we're going to kick it all right back to the agencies. We're going to sit down this time and we're going to list out every single thing that has come up over the last 248 years, and we're going to list it all out and we're going to delegate it all to the agency. And now the courts can't do anything about it because we specifically, expressly delegated it all to the agency, right? That would put us right back into the situation we are now.
That's probably what they're going to try to do.
It's probably what they're going to try to do, for sure, especially on bits and pieces and, on a long enough trajectory. Even if they chiseled away back at the rights that got back onto the Constitution side, if you will, and the people's side, even if they chiseled away with it, fast forward 80 years, right? What would that look like? Over every couple of months, it got chiseled away more, and then that generation is just born into whatever that, vastly astray society that may be at that point, right? So again, don't be afraid of any surface level arguments that may people try to throw up in your face against this. Pay attention to the legislatures right now and exactly what they're going to do. That's going to be very telling. And I can tell you what not to do right now is don't go up and get in a TSA agent's face and be like, I can interfere with you, blah, blah, blah. And you're just going to get arrested. And then you're going to go, they're going to lock you up, and then you're going to have to challenge it, and you're going to be in the court system for years at that point. There's a good chance a court will probably side with you eventually, but don't do that. Yeah. It's more of now go to the legislature and let's talk to the legislature. Say, hey, let's look at what happened during COVID, how vastly astray this went. Do we really want to delegate this over, or do we want to have a specific law that specifically says the agency cannot make a rule on this? Why don't we close that door instead of maybe leaving it open for a future generation to go through? Why not close that door off, but leave a caveat and say something to the effect of, however, they're not allowed to do this under any circumstances. We, the legislature can decide to do this. However, we will revisit this topic every 6 months or whatever interval is appropriate based off the circumstances to look at the then current science and facts to see if we want to change our mind and legislate new laws and keep the power with the legislature at that point.
Yeah, I hope it goes somewhere along those lines.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that it doesn't just get sucked right back in and repackaged in a new way. Because they're going to try to do it. I mean, you see, Biden's running on, he's going to reinstate Roe v. Wade. So I don't know how he thinks the Supreme Court decides on something and then he's just going to go change it. I don't know how he thinks he has authority to do that, right? But you can see with things like that, they don't like the ruling of the Supreme Court, which we talked about that on one of the previous episodes, and that whole thing
with Roe v. Wade.
Yeah, that should be handled in the states.
Right.
Like that has nothing to do with the federal government.
Right.
You know what I mean? The federal government shouldn't be overseeing that.
Again, if you're gonna go. If you're gonna stay. Right. If we're gonna be a democracy, be a democracy. If we're gonna be a republic, be a republic. If we're gonna be a tyrannical system, be a tyrannical system. This wishy-washy, we're going to pick and choose when we want to apply these certain things, that doesn't really give much stability in the law.
Yeah.
And for us as a society, that's not stable. It's not.
So we'll see what they do, but at least everyone now has a better understanding of what that case was, why that ruling was so important, and maybe we can start to see that we have just got out of a very toxic relationship.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good way of putting
and
it.
we can make some better decisions next time around.
They're going to keep texting you. They're going to keep texting you. They're going to call you.
They're going
to say they miss you.
Yeah.
They were sorry.
Yeah. You were the best. We're going to do it different next
time.
Right. It's not going to be
I'm
like
sorry.
This. Yeah, so hopefully the American people don't fall for that crap and wind up back in the same position, but also wind up back in a worse position because the government's going to look at this. These agencies are to protect themselves. You have a government class now, right, which self-perpetuates more government. You know what I mean? The more the government can and these agencies can communicate or come up with ways to show that they're important, right? They're going to ask for more money, more authority, so that they can do more stuff. You know what I mean? Every single government agency, it doesn't matter which one you work for, at the end of every fiscal year, when I was in the Navy, they would, at the end of the fiscal year, everyone would just get gear from the supply, anything that was extra, like, hey, take this, hey, you want extra Camelback, hey, here's Leatherman, here's 5 freaking flashlights. We don't care, give them to your family members for Christmas. You know what I mean? Like, they would dump inventory so they could basically go, look, we're out of gear. So we don't run out of gear next year, we need more money, right? And that's like one of the things, like with, law enforcement, and these federal agencies, like, well, you don't want to fix and stop the drug trafficking.
Right.
If we stop all the drugs and there is no more drugs, think of how much revenue we would lose if there was no drugs, because we make money, we get to argue our importance. We get money off of those fines. There's all these other rules and regulations that we get to enforce to help get the drugs off the streets, and there's war on crime and all this stuff. So there's the agencies are always looking for ways to basically solidify their existence, and then also grow their power and the size, right? So they can do more work. You know what I mean? And the only thing that we have to realize is that they're going to see this and not only try to get the power back, but the way they try to get the power back, I can almost guarantee it's going to work like this. They're going to try to get the power back in a way that ensures that they don't lose it again.
Sure, for sure.
And actually get more power because of that. They're going to have more power and more authority, right, on the tail end if we don't handle it correctly.
Yeah, you see, like, waving back and forth, right? Like, I don't know how to articulate this particular principle, but like a pendulum, if you will, right? The pendulum just snapped back in a on the opposite side of agencies in the federal government, right? And if they're going to try to grab it back forcefully, that's a violent snapback. That's a forceful, very powerful snapback at that point. Those types of things, and you see them throughout history, are very concerning,
Yeah. Hopefully the states will wake up and start taking some of these authorities or some of these responsibilities back to a state level, because most of this stuff was never actually assigned. Like, this was never part of like the federal responsibility.
Yeah, and again, like,
and that comes into like the Commerce Clause, right?
Yeah,
the Commerce Clause is the one thing that opened up the same thing like with Chevron is to all this. The Commerce Clause is to the federal government having the door open so they could do the Chevron Clause.
I think that was our first podcast, was talking about the Commerce Clause, and specifically the way the ATF was founded, right? And just to shortcut that, there's a Supreme Court case that basically said that the Constitution reads that Congress shall regulate the commerce between the states. And for the longest time throughout American history, unless the trade good, whatever that good was, whether it was a cow, a car, oranges, lemons, whatever, right? Whatever it was selling, if it crossed state lines, Congress could step in and regulate that. But if it stayed in between the state, if it was locally grown orange here in Florida, and it was sold at the local farmers market here in Florida, for the longest time, Congress couldn't step in and regulate that. Well, the Supreme Court eventually came in and said, well, now, specifically in this case, in the case that extended or broadened the Commerce Clause, specifically the Supreme Court came in, and this guy was growing and harvesting his own wheat in his own property, and he was, I would think he was using it at his own table or selling it right down the local store or something. I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was all local. It was all very much in the same community. And the Supreme Court reasoned that because that guy was now affecting interstate commerce, because he was no longer purchasing wheat for himself because he grew it for himself, wheat could have come in from another state line. Therefore, it's affecting interstate commerce. Therefore, the Commerce Clause can now reach in and regulate how that guy's going to grow wheat in his backyard, right? And the ATF, that was breathed into life specifically because of that ruling. Specifically because of that particular ruling with that dude who grew wheat in his own backyard. And again, I forget if he either used it as his own table or sold it to the local store down the road. So they're saying because there wasn't interstate commerce, it could have affected interstate commerce.
The fact that it affected interstate, what a roundabout bunch of bullshit.
Because this guy should have, and maybe he was going to buy wheat from another state. We don't know where that wheat was going to come from, but it could have come from another state. It could affect interstate commerce. Therefore, the Commerce Clause now extends all the way to your kitchen table.
It's insanity.
Yeah, and that's still on the books.
Yeah,
that's Chevron's overruled, but that one's still in the books.
That one's still in the books, but that's the one that opened up the Pandora's box. That's the Trojan horse, really.
The ATF would have never come. Well, maybe it would have come into existence eventually through another channel, but that's the channel the ATF, and not to keep picking on the ATF, but like obviously that's popular to your crowd, right? That's what specifically the channel that the ATF was breathed into life through.
Yeah, it's wild. Well, I appreciate you coming back on and sharing this insight and, just giving everyone an in-depth look at what all this entailed.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
And what it means for them. So
cool.
Well, I appreciate it, guys. So thank you for tuning in to the Full Spectrum Warriors podcast. If you like this episode, go ahead, like it, follow us on there, and share it with a friend. Obviously, we talked about a lot of throttled topics and used words that are bad words. You know what I mean? So obviously the throttling and the shadow banning of our content will continue because they don't like what we're saying. So we need you guys to help spread the word. So if you found this to be useful, share it with a friend, let them know. And yeah, man, we appreciate you tuning in. Once again, the Full Spectrum Warriors podcast is sponsored by the All-American Patriot brand, Grunt Style, and we appreciate their support. And if you want to check out their clothing line, head on over to gruntstyle.com and you can use code RICH15 for 15% off your orders. So again, guys, thanks for tuning in, and we'll have you back on the next one.